The influential House of Commons Public Accounts Committee, and it is one of the most respected House of Commons select committees, has issued a damning report. The committee found that of £2 billion claimed illicitly during the pandemic, just £10 million had been recovered. According to the report, around £1 billion of unlawfully distributed loans have apparently just been written off by the government. The report slammed a lack of curiosity over COVID bounce-back loans made to businesses with minimal checks and a laissez-faire attitude to the distribution of the funds. I'm very pleased now to be joined by Lord Agnew, who was the minister in charge of tackling fraud, who resigned rather spectacularly from the government and then actually handed his portfolio over to me. Lord Agnew, you found as a minister it was very frustrating trying to stop the fraud in the first place and then get anyone to take it seriously. Why didn't the government care?
Well, it's completely perplexing to me because these are large sums of money going to bad people. It shouldn't be a political issue. It should just be common sense. And what's interesting is in the Times today they report on the thing you've just mentioned, but 3 or 4 pages on, they talk about the rising interest debt burden of this country. And in the last year, the interest debt burden has gone up by £34 billion. And here we have, in this situation, an opportunity to recover billions of pounds that would help at least reduce the debt burden. So I'm completely flummoxed.
And when the systems were set up, there was a desire to get money out of the door as quickly as possible. And there seemed to be no pause for thought to see if the applications were fraudulent or were well-founded.
That's correct. I mean, it's almost exactly 3 years ago that the scheme was launched, the Bounce Back Loan Scheme. And at the time, I had very, very terse discussions with officials and indeed ministers to implore them to put tests, to put checks in before the money went out of the door, and they were all brushed aside.
And that's the really puzzling thing. But why at that point did people not want to listen to you? That you were only talking about checks that were taking potentially 24 hours. It wasn't going to bung up the whole system.
I think they simply didn't understand that that's really all it needed. A cheque that would have delayed the process, not even a day actually, would have saved a great deal of money, but the message simply didn't get through.
Because money was going to companies that had only just been set up or companies that had never done any business, and they were just sucking funds from the state without any proper checks.
Correct. I mean, there were 1,500 companies that received the money that didn't exist when the COVID epidemic actually occurred. So they literally received the money for doing nothing.
And that cheque could have been done in about 30 seconds, getting in touch with Companies House.
Correct, because in those situations, all they had to do was actually check when the company started trading, which they didn't even bother to do.
And we tried, you were very helpful to me, to get a dashboard of the banks with the worst fraud levels and the worst bad loan levels. We found this was very strongly opposed, which I couldn't understand. Some banks done quite well, some banks done appallingly. Again, why do you think there was such opposition to making this information public so people could judge for themselves?
Well, I think it simply shines a light on the whole inadequacy of the scheme, which is why they don't want people to see it. But it was down to your persistence that we got the dashboard, and it was published again a couple of months ago in February, and I still hope that will continue, because every time it happens, it reinforces the argument, and hopefully one day a minister somewhere will wake up and put 2 and 2 together that there is a lot of money going begging.
Indeed, and that's what's so puzzling about it, that, as you say, this is sort of free money for a government which has highest tax level in 70 years, expenditure that is running at levels that we haven't historically seen. It needs to get cash back, and yet on this particular issue, because it's embarrassed by the policy failures of 3 years ago, or because the money's been spent and it just doesn't care, it's not looking after it.
It's probably a combination of those two things. And it's important to remember it was a very big scheme. It was £47 billion that was thrown out of the door. And, you know, most of it was for good reason. But there's a very high percentage that went to the wrong people, and we could still get it back if the will was there.
And you've absolutely highlighted this. I mean, your resignation, you put down your folder in the House of Lords and said, I'd had enough, I'm off. In my view, that actually made people focus on this in a way that they hadn't before. So I hope you feel you can take some credit for getting some interest attached to this subject.
Well, I think I was fortunate that you took over the brief after I left, and you kept the flag flying, and you pushed through the creation of the Public Sector Fraud Authority, which is a bit more in that is now available, but it still needs some ministerial oversight and just some challenge to those banks who received that money. And let's remember that a lot of bank loans were paid back by this money because it was free, the interest rate was zero for the first year. So the banks did extremely well out of it as well.
Yes, the banks were able to shift their risk profile, weren't they, from loans to businesses to loans that were fully backed by the government and the interest rate paid by a year. So they, of course, wanted to do this.
Exactly. So they have an obligation, in my view, to work harder at this, because it was a huge saving to them. They managed to get rid of probably a lot of doubtful debts that could have gone bad and put those through the scheme, which was a huge saving to them. So, yes.
Do you think in hindsight that the scheme was overall justified, or do you think that looking at it, it should have been done very differently and much more tightly?
Well, I mean, I don't believe in hindsight, really, because it doesn't correct the situation. I mean, there was a parallel scheme called C-bills, where in that situation, 20% of the risks remain with the banks, and the losses on that for fraud have been far, far lower because self-interest prevails. And so, theoretically, that's what they should have done. At the time, we were told the banks wouldn't participate because they couldn't move quickly enough. I think if they just put the fraud checks in at the beginning and pursued it more aggressively since then, we would be in a lot better position.
Well, I think capitalism works with shared risk. Lord Agnew, thank you very much.